After weeks of an offensive against the Gaza Strip, Israel's staunch ally, the United States, has raised concern on the future of the war. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is headed to Tel Aviv for talks. And according to reports, the United States has now delayed the delivery of over 20,000 M16 rifles. The reason could be rising attacks by extremist Israeli settlers against Palestinians in the West Bank. The State Department imposed sanctions on Israelis who are suspected of being involved in violent acts against Palestinians not too long ago. The assault rifle deal is now being subjected to another review by the State Department. Israel put a request for these rifles in the initial days of the war for civilians' response teams living on the border villages. These teams act as first responders in case of any attack. All of this comes at a time when White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is on a two-day visit to Israel starting on Thursday. Sullivan says the timeline of the war is on the table along with the country's post-war plan for Gaza. U.S. President Joe Biden earlier said that due to Israel's indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, the country is losing support and that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu should change course. Biden also added Israel can't say no to a Palestinian state. Israel, however, has explicitly rejected the idea. Israel has also been at loggerheads with the United States about what the future of Gaza would look like. While the United States favors the idea of the Palestinian Authority returning to govern Gaza after the war, Israel has completely ruled out such a plan.
It is imperative, it remains imperative that Israel put a premium on civilian protection. And there does remain a gap between exactly what I said when I was there, the intent to protect civilians, and the actual results that we're seeing on the ground.
The U.S. earlier had also said that there remains a gap between what Israel intends to do and the results being produced on the ground. Washington has time and again emphasized that civilian protection must be Israel's top priority. But will U.S. concerns affect Washington's military aid for Israel? And will Israel pay a price for the number of civilian casualties in Gaza? Our correspondent Jody Cohen has sent us this report from Israel. Take a look.
U.S. National Security Advisor Sullivan is in Israel on Thursday for meetings to discuss the timetable of the war, with the U.S. wanting to see the main fighting over by January and Israel saying the war must end when Hamas is no longer a threat and the 135 remaining Israeli hostages have been returned. They're also likely to discuss aid and who should govern a post-war Gaza. The U.S. would like to see the Palestinian Authority take on this role, but Prime Minister Netanyahu has said Gaza can't be led by an entity that supports, teaches and finances terror. Meanwhile, Hamas chief Haniyeh has called for negotiations on a ceasefire, including continued Hamas rule in Gaza after the war. The US is against the ceasefire but would like to see talks on another temporary truce. Israel has suggested it first needs to see a signal that Hamas is really interested in another deal. In the meantime, they believe military pressure is the best way to make that happen. And according to one report, Israel has asked Egypt to mediate. This is Jody Cohen for WION World as One.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more on this. And to give us more insight, we have with us Dr. Adam Day, head of the Geneva office of United Nations University Center for Policy Research from Geneva. Thank you so much for joining us on WION, Dr. Day. I don't know if you heard our correspondent Jody Cohen right now with her reporting. She said that the United States may be open to a humanitarian pause. What was interesting is just a few days ago, the United States was one of the only countries who actually voted against something like this at the General Assembly. Do you see President Biden's support for Netanyahu and by extension Israel waning at any time soon? And then why is it that it would vote like that if it does want to see a humanitarian pause?
Thanks, Susan. It's great to be here. And I think what you're really seeing is a crisis point in the U.S. support for Israel here. And just this week in the General Assembly resolution, which passed with 153 votes in favor, it really shows this huge support for a ceasefire. And I think you may be seeing Biden coming in line with that sense of international momentum going towards at least some sort of pause. I think there is a difference between a pause and a ceasefire, and what we saw in mid-November was a pause. I think that's probably more within the U.S. comfort zone. I don't think that the text of the ceasefire that you see in the General Assembly this week or in the Security Council throughout November is what the U.S. is talking about. But it's worth noting how strong this support is for a ceasefire, and more countries voted for a ceasefire in Gaza than voted to condemn Russia's aggression in Ukraine in March of last year. That's an extraordinarily high number, and I really think it has put Biden into this fairly uncomfortable position of needing to find some way to pressure Israel, given that level of support.
Yeah, Dr. Day, thank you so much for that nuanced point, because it seemed that the language this time on the UN General Assembly resolution was a lot stronger. And perhaps you're right, that's something that the United States wasn't comfortable with, nor was it the last time either. What's making headlines now? I don't know if you heard, former President Barack Obama's aide, David Axelrod, has talked about dark, dark days for President Biden's reelection hopes. He's made these comments before, of course, but now it's in the midst of this Israel-Gaza war. And many believe that perhaps many within President Biden's own party just don't agree with his policies when it comes to Israel. How much of this support waning do you think has to do with foreign policy, notably Israel?
Well, there's the kind of famous phrase that foreign policy is just domestic policy. And I think that you certainly see Biden is different than much of the Democratic position on this domestically. But I do think that he's feeling the pressure to a certain extent. You see him sending very senior people to the region to try to find a way forward. I think this is part of his re-election campaign to a certain extent, and there certainly is a lot of American sentiment that matters to him. I think the challenge is that he isn't able to provide a package of issues that is going to satisfy Israel and move to what Jake Sullivan is talking about, which is that timeline alignment. I think that there's a significant difference that we'll see later today in the timeline vision between the U.S. and Israel, and in what's going to happen the day after. And I think that's the biggest challenge right now, is for Biden to come up with some sort of package that moves us to the day after.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. We'll be watching very closely. Dr. Adam Day, head of the Geneva office of United Nations University Center for Policy Research, joining us this morning from Geneva. Please do come back.
Thanks so much, Susan. Good to be here.